My name is Heather, and today my colleagues from the University of Alberta International, Lisa and Xiaoping, and I are going to talk about our experiences with multicultural groups. Lisa and I work with different groups of students on campus who both require intercultural experiences for the completion of their programs, the Certificate in International Learning and the International Visiting Student Program. So when the pandemic started last year, we created the Multicultural Learning Pods to provide a space for students to interact, create, and reflect. The pods brought together 56 domestic and international students situated in 4 time zones in pods of 2 to 5 students. The goal was to give the students regular international and facilitated intercultural contact where students could learn about culture, explore their own cultural identities and worldviews, and practice intercultural bridging. After the initial orientation, students met for 2 hours a week to explore weekly topics guided by Edward T. Hall's Map of Culture and to create some artifacts based on the discussions. Those artifacts were then used to produce a final project at the end of the program. One of the most interesting findings about the project was that with 56 students, there were 45 different self-identified cultural affiliations. That had us thinking about the fact that all group work on campus would have a similar composition of students with multicultural backgrounds, and how that influences the work that's done in the classrooms and specifically in group work.
So the composition of the multicultural learning pods made obvious that intercultural exchange is no longer, if it ever was, just a cross-border venture. Milton Bennett, who's a well-known intercultural scholar, says, we used to adhere to this notion that when in Rome, do as the Romans do. And that really assumed that people would travel somewhere and stay a while and really try to integrate into the context. And this is often the mantra for international students, come to Canada, integrate into Canadian culture, and you'll do well. But now our migration patterns have changed, our communication technologies have changed. And so to continue the metaphor, the Romans are now everywhere, and Rome is now everywhere, physically or virtually. And so we need to take that into account when we're even working within a Canadian domestic context. It means we need to be thinking about our domestic context as intercultural context. And as a proud or perhaps aspiring multicultural country, maybe we're already aware of this. And yet, how often do we treat our classrooms and group work in particular as an opportunity for intercultural exchange? Students will bring their multi-layered cultural selves to collaborative learning. They'll bring their national culture, sure, but also their ethnic culture and lingual, there's age, class, religion, a myriad of other cultural groups that they'll affiliate with. And so whether we plan for it or not, these are the people who are showing up in our classrooms. And these range of perspectives that they can access with all of these affiliations is a great asset to the classroom, to their ability to problem solve and think critically. They can see from very different points of view. And that's something that we want all of our graduates to have. But it can also be a hindrance, and particularly so when students get confused or frustrated by the behavior of their counterparts. And some of that behavior can be culturally rooted. So what might this look like? I'm going to pass it over to Xiaoping to give you a personal example.
Following 2 pictures are both about the university classrooms. One is in a Chinese university and one is in a Canadian university. They may look similar, but do they actually? I will talk a bit about it from my own experiences. I was born and raised in China, and I completed my first 2 degrees in China too. I taught in 2 Chinese universities for 12 years before I came to Canada. It was 2008, I believe, when I got the opportunity to teach a group of American students in their summer study in China program. It was a short course on modern Chinese history. It was my first time teaching non-Chinese students, so I worked very hard to prepare my lecture notes. However, it seemed that I didn't need to prepare that much. Before I could finish covering the content I prepared, I was always interrupted by the students. They had many questions to ask and many comments to make, good questions and good comments. All of the students were very active, and they would be also commenting on each other's comments. It was quite different from what I experienced with my Chinese students. They would always let me finish my lecture and then ask questions if they had. I had to work very hard to find ways for them to participate in the discussions or group works. There were indeed some differences in the learning styles and expectations between my Chinese students and the American students that I taught. I began my life here as an international student taking graduate courses. I was excited about the opportunity after I taught English for many years in China. I finally had the opportunity to study in the authentic English speaking environment. There were more open-ended discussions and more group works. There were more opportunities for students to speak in class. While I was a student in China, I was among the first students to speak in class. In Canada, I found that I was among the last. My Canadian classmates always beat me to it. I found myself spending more time thinking about professors' questions. I always wanted to develop a thought that was really mature, really smart, something that really made sense first. And then I would try to put that into good English with good grammar. My Canadian classmates seemed to be able to speak right away, and they were able to develop their thoughts while they were speaking. I read somewhere a piece of research showing that they would speak to cover up the fact that they didn't do the reading. I learned that the expectation for students in the Canadian classroom is that they must actively participate in discussions. My deep thinking would not be visible and would not be appreciated. I tried to push myself to speak faster and earlier before I lost my opportunities to speak at all. It took some courage to speak before I felt I was entirely ready. It took some time to develop the skills in thinking while talking. And this is after my 2 degrees in English and 12 years of English teaching experiences in China. I understand the challenges for Chinese students here in Canada. Merely passing their TOEFL or IELTS is not enough. They will need to get much more experienced in communication in English to become equal contributors in their classroom.
So in this case, Xiaobing found ways to adapt the behavior of her Canadian counterparts. And this is generally where the responsibility lies on the international student or on the minority student to adapt. But one of the wonderful things we found in the pods was that the Canadian normed students also adapted. The curriculum for the program framed culture as something that we all enact. And we saw a recognition that in order to learn from and with each other, a new cultural normal needed to be established for each group. And so this is where mutual adaptation came into play. So one of the students, Jordan, in her intercultural project reflected on this, saying, I would always find myself talking to fill empty space in the air. I had a need to fill the silences because I thought that was a bad thing. I was acting based on my own ideas of what conversation ought to be. I thought that I was saving us from hearing the crickets, removing an awkward situation, and taking the burden off of others. What I recognize now is that I probably cut off my pod mates on several occasions. And toward the last of the pod's meetings, I had learned that I needed to be comfortable allowing silence, which was one of the big cultural self-reflection realization moments that I experienced. So this is what we'd like to see. We'd like to see students adapting to one another. And so how do we support and encourage this? We can start as instructors by explicitly valuing the various worldviews that students bring into the classroom and into their groups, and encouraging students to bring the different perspectives that they uniquely hold to the classroom, and explaining why those worldviews enrich the learning experiences for everyone. We can also keep an eye out for behaviors, especially if they appear to be troublesome or if they're creating tension in the group, that might be culturally rooted. And again, I'll turn it over to Xiaobing to talk a bit about silence as one of those behaviors.
So the meaning of silence might be taken as different in different cultural contexts. The silence shown in my class from me might be taken as the lack of interest, or I might be taken as not willing to participate, or lack of the initiative, or some understanding of it. However, it may be different level of comfort or getting ready to speak like me, and can be a different sense of time, different understanding of the turn taking. So in such situations, I would say some mindful listening would be appreciated, and inviting participation will work very well sometimes. And the use of visual supports and encouragement are also very important and would be really appreciated by the students.
So, another behavior that could be attributed to culture is the hierarchical structure of a group. So, one of the dominant groups in the pods came from a culture that is highly hierarchical and the other egalitarian. And often in the pods, we noticed that one person in the group was presuming a leadership role. And although it's very hard to identify culture as the only reason a particular person took on this role, we could speculate some of the reasons why this was happening. I think that in the group that was egalitarian, the students who were from the hierarchical cultural background expected and were waiting for someone to be identified as a leader of the group. And so sometimes they would step up and sort of take over and take control because they felt that someone had to do that and it wasn't being done, and they needed to have some sort of leader within the group. I think on the other side, when it was someone who was from the egalitarian cultural norms, it was because the other students who were from the hierarchical culture were lost as to what to do. And so nothing was getting done. There was nobody that was organizing the meetings or trying to figure out what was going on. And so they sort of stepped in to fill that role so that the things that needed to be accomplished in the groups could get done. So, when this happens, you have a student that maybe comes across as bossy, arrogant, or selfish, and it may create a lack of collaboration or consideration for the group members. But what this actually might be is just, like I said, there might be a different sense of status or hierarchy, and it's just not jiving together depending on the difference of the cultural norms. There may be also a different sense of time or time orientation. Some cultures, 10 minutes before is appropriate. For other cultures, being right on time is appropriate. And then some, it's much more flexible. 10 minutes late, 15 minutes late, even half an hour late is acceptable. So when you have those differences in the groups, that can create a lot of friction and a lot of frustration. There may also be different expectations around work allocation. Who does the work? Who tells who to do the work? And who makes those decisions? So, some of the things that we can do, there can be instructor mediation. Instructors or professors can step in and sort of help to facilitate more of that discussion. There can also be instructors' suggested timelines or even group structures. You may choose the people that belong to a particular group because of who they are. And there also may be incentive for the process of collaboration that helps to mitigate some of these problems.
The truth is we won't always know what the reasons for student behaviors are. Shocking, I know. And if you're not familiar with cultural patterns of behavior, it might seem daunting to even identify a cultural misunderstanding. or to try and bridge a quote unquote cultural difference. But one prudent place to start is for instructors and students alike to perspective check. So internally with yourself, what might I be assuming about this situation or interaction? What is the story I'm telling myself about this interaction? But then also externally with the student or with someone who has cultural knowledge that you can draw on. So what I hear and see is, and then offer your interpretation, is that correct? Or I'm not sure how to interpret, and then describe the behavior. Does it mean, and then offer some hypotheses. There's so many more things we could talk about the pods, about culture in the classroom. And so we invite you to come to our question and answer session on June 21st at 10:30 in the morning, and have a conversation about your experiences, dive deeper into our experiences with the pods as well. And if you can't make it, please reach out to us with any questions or comments that you might have. Here is our contact information, and we look forward to hearing from you.